Hello everyone, let's begin our module 7 of the chapter The Three Orders. In our earlier modules, we have learned that how the European economy was growing because of the agriculture as well as because of the trade, the new towns were emerging. Now in this module, we are totally looking at a different aspect of the medieval Europe. That is, we are basically looking at how by the 14th century the entire Europe was in a condition of crisis. By the early 14th century, Europeans' economic expansion slowed down. In this module, we are basically trying to focus on the factors which led to the crisis of the 14th century in the entire Europe. By the end of 14th century, Europe's economic expansion slowed down. This was due to various factors. First, in the northern Europe, by the end of the 13th century, the warm summers of the previous 300 years have given way to bitter cold summers. That means there was a climatic change in the Europe. Seasons for growing crops were reduced by a month and it became difficult to grow crops on higher ground. Storms and oceanic flooding destroyed many farms, which resulted in less income in the taxes for the government. The opportunities offered by favorable climate conditions before the 13th century had led to large-scale reclamation of land of forests and pastures for agriculture, which we have actually studied in an earlier module, that how because of the warming of the climate the agriculture was practiced more and more, but now the climate was further changing and it was becoming cold. The intensive plowing had exhausted the soil despite the practice of the three-field rotation of crops because clearance was not accompanied by proper soil conservation. The shortage of pasture reduced the number of cattle as well. The population growth has outstripped the resources and the immediate result was famine. Severe famines hit Europe, so the first reason of the crisis was a change in the climatic condition and the decrease of the soil fertility. Now second, in addition, trade was hit by a severe shortage of metal currency because of a shortage in the output of silver mines in Austria and Serbia. So most of the currency was of silver in the medieval Europe, and this silver used to come from Austria and the Serbia, but their mines were exhausted, because of which there was shortage of currency, which further forced governments to reduce the silver content of the currency and to mix it with cheaper metals. It basically means that there was devaluation of the entire currency. But the worst was yet to come. As trade expanded in the 13th and 14th century, ships carrying goods from distant countries had started arriving in the European ports. Along with ship came rats carrying the deadly plague infection, which is referred to as the Black Death. This was the third factor which was responsible for the crisis of the 14th century, the plague infection caused by the rats which came from the ships. Western Europe, relatively isolated in earlier centuries, was hit by the epidemic between 1347 and 1350. The modern estimate of mortality is that epidemic was so bad that 20% of people of the whole Europe died, while in some places 40% of the population died. So this basically indicates that how the epidemic was severe, which you can easily relate to the today's condition as well. As trade cities were hardest hit, it in enclosed communities like monasteries and convents, when one individual contracted the plague, it was not long before everyone did. And in almost every case, none survived. The plague took its worst toll among the infants, the young, and the elderly. This is the clear situation that we are also facing today. So in the medieval Europe, the disease was plague caused by the rat. There were other relative minor episodes of plague in the 1360s and 1370s as well. The population of Europe, 73 million in 1300, stood reduced to 45 million in the 1400. This was one of the major reasons of the crisis. This catastrophe, combined with the economic crisis, caused immense social dislocation. Depopulation resulted in a major shortage of labor. Serious imbalances were created between agriculture and manufacture because there were not enough people to engage in both equally. Prices of agriculture goods dropped as there were fewer people to buy. Wage rate increased because the demand for labor, particularly agrarian labor, rose in England by as much as 250% in the aftermath of the Black Death. The survival labor force could now demand twice their earlier wages. As the population was decreasing, there were no laborers, and this time it was beneficial for the laborers because they could demand more from the employers. But this condition in the Europe, the crisis of the 14th century, further led to the social unrest in the medieval society. The income of lord was thus badly hit because of the costly labor. It declined as agriculture prices came down and wages of laborers increased. In desperation, they tried to give up the money contracts they had entered into and revive labor services. This was violently opposed by peasants, particularly the better educated and more prosperous ones. That means that they wanted to come back to the feudal ties that they used to have in the 11th century, but now because the laborers were less, they were actually dominating the lords, but they did not wanted this situation to arise. In 1323, peasants revolted in Flanders, in 1858 in France, and in 1381 in England. So the peasants basically revolted against the lords who wanted to revive the feudal ties. These rebellions were ruthlessly crushed. It is significant that they occurred with most violent intensity in those areas which had experienced the prosperity of the economic expansion. So peasants were basically trying to protect their gains, but lords were trying to take all of their gains because the economy was in crisis. Despite the severe repression, the sheer intensity of peasant opposition ensured that the old feudal relation could not be reimposed. The money economy was far advanced to be reversed. Therefore, though the lord succeeded in crushing the revolts, the peasant ensured that the feudal privileges of earlier days could not be reinvented. So peasants revolted, they were suppressed by the lords, but they ensured that repression that they have to face because of the earlier feudal ties, it could not happen again. So basically by the end of 14th century, the feudalism was weakening, and because of these all factors and the weakening of the feudalism, we see the rise of monarchy or the king rule in the Europe, about which we are going to study in our next module.